Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Noel Mason, and I will be your host for today. So before we start the webinar, just a quick brief about HCC Technologies. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're a ServiceNow Silver Sales and Services partner that's headquartered out of Montreal, Canada. We have offices in New Delhi, Toronto, and New York. Our specialty is solely on the ServiceNow platform, where we help organizations unlock their hidden value. Today's webinar is about Cmdb, and we have none other than Hisham Gamiri to talk about how to plan your ServiceNow ServiceNow Cmdb. Hisham is the author of the best written book around ServiceNow Cmdb called ServiceNow 101 and 201, Awaken Your Service Management from Within. Hisham has well over 15 years of experience in the Cmdb arena, not just with the ServiceNow platform, but with CA Solutions, HPSM, and other platforms before ServiceNow. So today's webinar is around planning your Cmdb, our first of 4 webinars where we explain how you should approach a Cmdb implementation. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have some time towards the end for some Q&A. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Hisham.
Thanks, Noel. I hope everyone is doing great today. Sorry for moving this webinar quite a few times, I think at least 5 times. Someone told me on, I think, Friday that I should plan better the webinars than planning the Cmdb. So, joking aside, what is a Cmdb? So what we'll try to do in this webinar is segment it into 4 parts. Part 1 today is to discuss how to plan for a Cmdb. So how to even get started and why. Part 2, which will be covered in the next webinar, will discuss the design of the Cmdb. And then in the subsequent webinars, we'll discuss how to build that Cmdb. But overall, we have the word Cmdb, we have the word SACM, we throw in the word configuration management. But in reality, when we look at this slide here, what we try to represent is that at the core of ServiceNow is the Cmdb. So what makes ServiceNow different than other solutions is that it was built from the same data model where, having been involved with solutions like CA or IBM or BMC, they were built open acquisitions in the past 20 years. So the data model of the heart of the architecture is completely off because they had to group multiple data sets. So when we look at the purpose of Cmdb, the purpose of Cmdb or the purpose of the Service Asset Configuration Management process is to help, in reality, accelerate or help manage the other processes that are in scope depending on the company. So it's either to help us resolve incidents quickly, or determine root cause, or determine the impact of any given change in the infrastructure. So when we look at the shared architecture, as I was saying, the purpose of the Cmdb itself, all the data found in ServiceNow, is to be able to present the services that are being provided by either from internal resources or people in the cloud, the ability to present those services to consumers. And those consumers then go to the same data set to use those services. The idea then is that from that unique Cmdb or from that unique central database, I'm able to run reports, execute SLAs, provide knowledge, and then support the processes in scope for the depending of the organizations. And those processes, the data is being fed from different places, such as ServiceNow Discovery or any ITOM solutions in place. So the context of it is that most organizations, they start from limited trust. So most clients that we deal with, they usually start from, okay, I don't trust my data. Why? Because maybe the processes for governance are not in place. Lack of holistic architecture, service-oriented information, a focus on the data itself, but not enough focus on the business side. Lack of visibility into relationships. And even there, the question is, do I need the relationships? What type of relationships do I need to maintain, and so on? Relationships are very hard to control. And then visibility into supporting infrastructure. And today, even with the cloud, it becomes very hard to support the infrastructure internally or externally, or know what we have based on what's in the cloud. So when we look at a holistic view of the CMDB, we need to focus on, in green here, I try to represent the enterprise architecture. So any plan of the CMDB, however we want to tackle it, and depending on the size of the organization, it's very important to involve enterprise architecture from the onstart. The enterprise architecture that can be a one people or a holistic group, they are there to make sure that the ITSM group, the service management group, is aligned with from planning, what the service structure looks like, and what is the IT governance to put in place. Once we jump into the blue here, where we try to represent the service management, obviously the CMDB helps identify the impact of incidents, the document the known errors from a problem management, identify the impact of changes in the infrastructure at a given time, have a good release policy in place, and then as we evolve into a maturity, then the ability to do capacity, SLAs, availability, and service continuity management. In orange here, the idea behind it is that we need to represent that CMDB to the end users via the catalog, where the end users can request work or request their services and see the status of the service management of the business services that are being provided. So the idea here is that all three, depending of the colors that you choose, they are used to represent how we go from IT planning to configuration management, what the CMDB, and then the idea is to represent that in a holistic way. So the question is how to get there. Go, get set, go. How to get started from a CMDB perspective. And the idea with this first webinar is to discuss really how to get started. So it's like being a chef, and I'm very bad at cooking. I don't wish anyone to eat my food that I serve. But the whole idea, when joking aside, is that it's really running a CMDB or running service management. It's like running a kitchen. So number one, as a chef, you need to get your ingredients, in the market or different places. So in the CMDB, number one goal for planning is to establish the vision and goals. So the vision is determined by the use cases or the issues that an organization is facing at that moment. Some organizations are focused more on change management because they might be doing many changes in the infrastructure and they are not able to tell what is the impact, or they're not even able to notify their end users and say, okay, well, I'm making a change on service B. It's going to be affected on Saturday night. These are the end users that I need to notify, or the stakeholders. So it's very important to determine the use cases. Some other organizations maybe are more focused on establishing the impact and doing a quick resolution on incidents. Some other organizations who are maybe on a higher maturity need to have a good CMDB from an asset perspective in order to establish what they have, how much they're consuming, and so on. So the vision and goal for an organization is different. So there is no one way of putting a CMDB in place. So it's very important to establish the vision and the goals, and to know that a good vision takes time. So it's very important to build a roadmap to attain the holy grail of a good information that is not only there to be used, but it's very important to trust the information that's there. So it's like buying a used car or a new car. Because when you buy a new car, everyone knows that as soon as it's off the garage, it loses 3%. So the data in the CMDB, as soon as it's loaded, it's already not good, especially now that all the infrastructure is moving into the cloud, where it moves and very fast. It's very important to establish a vision, goals, and then the governance. So step number 2 is how are we going to make sure that we can trust that data? So it's very important to establish a process governance in place by number 1, establishing a second committee, so a service asset configuration management committee. And number 2, identify the service owners, identify the process managers. So who is the incident manager, who is the major incident manager process owner, who is the change manager process owner. So it's very important to put in, once we have the vision and goals, number 2, establish a process governance. How are we going to maintain the information? A lot of folks focus on discovery, and they say, yeah, CMDB is discovery. So if I buy a discovery tool, then I have a CMDB. And that is a formula for failure. So a good CMDB has nothing to do with discovery. I can discover the word. If I don't have a good process and a good governance in place and establish why I am discovering those CIs, then that CMDB becomes useless, and then it loses its trust. So that takes us into step number 3, design the model. So designing the model of that CMDB, which we will tackle into the next webinar, will help load only the data that we need. So the whole idea here is that the less information we have in that CMDB, the better. The more we have, the less that CMDB becomes important or critical to help us manage our information. So it's very important to establish the vision and goals, then putting in place a governance, and then designing the CMDB model on paper. So what type of information I need to have, what type of relationships I want, and why do I need that information? Once we have step 1, 2, and 3, which has nothing to do with the tool sets that we have chosen, then we can move into step number 4, which is construct that CMDB. And constructing the CMDB, basically, that's where that is based on the tool sets that we have chosen. So if I'm running ServiceNow Discovery, ServiceNow Service Mapping, constructing that CMDB is different than if I don't have a tool, or if I'm using any other CMDB tool sets out there. Construction the CMDB based on that model, based on the processes that we put in place, based on the end goals, that will help us to move that CMDB into production and deploy it. So it's very important to focus, number 1, on the goal, number 2, on the governance, number 3, defining the model on paper, and then constructing that CMDB. So step number 4 is the easy one. So if we start by running discovery without thinking about the model that we want to have, the process that we need to put in place, and what is our ultimate vision and goals, then that is a success. for failure or a failure for success. So that is a failed recipe there. It's like boiling the water without having the ingredients in the first place. So how do we establish a vision and goals? The vision and goals is established based on the use cases that we want to tackle. So in this case, we have taken one use case regarding incident management. So its current situation for any given company might be that incident resolution time is too long, or when incidents occur and the investigation is ineffective and the same incidents are being happening again, which ends up impacting our user satisfaction. So users are not satisfied because the resolution time takes too long. So the possible causes of this is that the incident record does not contain the right information. The access to the CI, to the affected configuration items, is not there. The resolving groups are not being attached to the CIs. The resolver groups are not being able to view the history of that specific CI. So how will a CMDB help in this case? So the CMDB helps in this case by determining the CI status. Is it something that's active, inactive? Is it operational or not? Determine the impact of the relationship, this CI that's been affected, this configuration item, which business services is being affected. So if I have a projector that is down in a classroom and I'm providing a class in a university, then that classroom is down. That providing that class, which is my main business service, is down. Which is a completely different thing than if I look at an application that is used to provide, for example, in universities, we have two types of training. So either we provide in classes in a physical classroom, the old way, or we're providing a class online through an application that's either hosted internally or in the cloud. So if a projector, which is an asset, in this case, is down, I'm not able to provide that class in the physical classroom. But if an application is down in the data center or the cloud, then I'm not able to provide that class online. So it's very important to determine the goal and the vision of what we want to do. So in this case, maybe resolving the incidents will be like number one, which means I want to know what is being impacted and how I can resolve, which means then resolution of incidents becomes my step number one. So usually at this time I ask if there are any questions. So I don't see any questions yet on the board. So if you guys start putting in your questions, and we'll give maybe 5-10 minutes at the end to ask the questions, that would be nice. So we talked about the goals, we talked about the process, but what is the CMDB blueprint model? So that's a question that always comes back. What is that conceptual model on paper? A model is defined into 3 steps: scope, span, and methods. By scope, we mean what will be the potential content of that CMDB. So what are the categories and CI types that should be part of the CMDB? So how do we answer that question? It depends of the business needs of the given company. Every company is different. So are printers part of the CMDB? Maybe not, maybe yes, it all depends, but we do need to have that, to ask that questions. Maybe if we take a look at an organization like Bombardier Aerospace, who creates a plane, printing the plane parts for the engineers, it's very important to build the planes. So if the printers in the shop are down, means we cannot build the planes. So everyone needs to go home. So that CI type becomes very important to manage. So I see some questions coming in. So I will finish this slide, and I believe we have 8 minutes left after this. I will be able to ask the questions. So the scope, so agree, also document the CIs and the related processes. One other things in the CMDB is that maybe a certain CI type will only apply to incident management. So if we take workstations, for example, in the reality, I'm not going to do a change management on a particular configuration on a particular workstation, but I might be doing a change to indicate a certain type of CIs and say, we're doing a patch, a Microsoft patch on all Windows machines, on all workstations. So it's important to determine the generic CIs in this case. Third point in the scope, it's to agree on the common and mandatory and optional CI attributes. So I might say here that, for example, the support group field on all the CIs is mandatory. Or I might say status or operational status field is mandatory on all CIs. But for example, the operating system is a mandatory field on only the Windows type machine. The span or granularity of the content of the CMDB is how deep are we going to go. So once we have established the breadth of that CMDB, we need to establish the depth. So identify key attributes by CI types, document how those CI types are being interrelated to each other, and document how those CI types are being related, and also being able to work together to provide that given service. And once we identify on paper the scope and span, obviously we need to determine how are we going to build that CMDB. The whole idea here is that if we take a look at this slide, number 3, which is the method, how are we going to federate, synchronize, or bring even the data in, is third, it's not first. And that's where the mistake is. So the focus should be on determining the scope and span on paper first, and only then we can establish and say, okay, we have discovery running, then we're able to populate the Windows machine. We're able to build props or additional information to bring the information in. So let's get into the questions I believe we have. So number 1 question, how to plan CMDB based on companies' internal procedures. So let's see if we can give keyboard change presenter. So obviously politics or internal procedures are an affecting element in how a successful CMDB will be. Sometimes we waste a lot of time. My advice will be to determine that second committee and make sure that people are involved from the onstart, and the service management team should not be the only one focused on implementing the CMDB, but it's an organizational effort. So question from Henry. Henry says, again, getting buy-in from all the teams that will have to participate in the initial data collection, and how do you get the ongoing commitment to keep the data current? And how do you get the ongoing commitment to keep the data? So the only way to keep the data current is to put a good process in place. So people will only keep the information they want current. Basically, if the information that's being loaded in the CMDB is not relevant to them, they will never be able to either keep it current or want to have the goal to keep it current. So my answer to this is, number 1, make sure that the management of that CMDB is decentralized. So the responsibilities of maintaining the information is decentralized and is not centralized. Number two, make sure that the maintenance of the CMDB is part of the day-to-day, so which is ultimately part of the processes that you have in place. I hope this answers the questions. So will CMDB be affected by CAB? That's another question. It all depends of the CAB. Obviously, if a new service is being put in place, that new service needs to be approved by CAB. However, for the day-to-day management of the CMDB, my recommendation is to use or put in place a standard change management procedure to manage those changes. Are efforts more successful if they start at the top with services? I'm really sorry about the noise. Right, Noel, can you take over and respond to the answers? I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure thing. So just picking up on the question there, are efforts more successful if they start at the top with services or at the bottom with infrastructure? So our CMDB design, as Hisham alluded to in the previous slides, is determining the scope, span, and the method. So when you start talking about scope, we don't just look at the services element. We start going from one service all the way down to the infrastructure. One of the items that we look at, or when we engage in CMDB workshops, is we talk about the value and complexity. So what is the value in just determining a business service, and what is the value of not determining the infrastructure? So the answer to that question, in a very short way, is you can be successful in either area, from the top or from the bottom. It all comes down to what is your value, what is the complexity needed, and what are your business drivers. So once you identify those, that will basically drive which direction you want to start your CMDB construction. Is it from the top or from the bottom?
Thanks, Noel.
Go ahead.
We have. Sorry, guys, about the noise. Today is Canadian Thanksgiving, and the offices were supposed to be empty, but people, I guess, decided to just work. So really sorry about that. I think Noel just answered this question. Let me take on the next one, which is from Khadija. Thank you, Khadija, for the question assisting today. Is it recommended to implement one class or another one in a different phase? The idea is that what is more important is to determine your use case first. So if, let's say, you're starting from trying to resolve incidents quickly, or trying to identify problems, or trying to identify the impact, the whole idea is not to implement everything at the same time. So it's definitely a key success is to implement the CMDB in a roadmap approach, so in a phased approach. So we might be starting from implementing all the workstations. So maybe we can start from doing an asset management, because that's what's important, because we have to do a count on how much it's costing us to manage our workstations, including licensing. So recommendation not to take on too much, but definitely to have a phased approach. And last questions that we have here, let's see, from Henry again. Thank you, Henry, for the questions. Might trying the CMDB to system and application orchestrations tool may be a way of keeping the data up to date. Definitely, any kind of automation is welcome. So one of the key elements here, as you can see in the slide, Henry, is it's very important to define the ITOM architecture map, or what I call the IT operations management landscape. So when we look at the landscape, we carry it into 4 elements. So we have what we call the event management landscape, the automation, as you mentioned in your questions, the systems and network management tools, and then the data center management. So it's very important to look at holistically at all the tool sets that you have in place, and then put them into a categorization and say, okay, so do I have a service dependency mapping tool in place? Yes, I might use that. Do I have an automation tool in place? But the automation on its own, it's only half the answer. In order for something to exist, it needs to be requested. So most elements that are impacting your environment are actually started from what we call the request catalog. And so even if we have the best discovery tools in place, and we have the best orchestration tool sets in place, and everything is automated, in order for that to be automated, or in order for a VM to actually be started, someone is actually requesting that VM. And that's where most companies fail, is because they don't focus enough on the request. So what is that work being generated? Where is that work being started? Who's requesting those business services? So it's very important to determine the requests upfront, determine how are we going to provide those services, and only then we can automate the whole chain or the whole workflow. So ServiceNow is a workflow engine. It's not more, not less than that. It is one of the best workflow today. So today, that tool in most companies is not used. We cannot just turn on discovery. We cannot just turn on. We might have all the tool sets in place. If we don't define the processes and how the information is being requested or is being added in the first place, that CMDB will never be successful. And it's the same thing with change management. Most people focus on deploying the change. So they use change in order to deploy what's going into production. But that there's a whole life cycle before that happens. How is that change was actually built in the first place? So how is the release working? And that release is most likely coming from a project. So how is that project management being even used? And how is that connected to service management? So we really have to identify the inputs and the outputs in order to orchestrate the information. I'm sorry about my long answers. I guess I like to talk a lot, but we're a bit over. I'm not sure if you guys have any additional questions, or we have answered some of your questions today. Oh, we have one more. What is the best way to plan CMDB without any performance issues? That's a question from Akhil. I'm really not sure about these questions. Any performance issues? I personally never seen performance issues in ServiceNow per se. We have done implementations where we had over 15 integrations and discovery running and service mapping running and orchestrations, and we never once had any performance issues as far as their platform is concerned. I'm not sure, Akhil, if you can elaborate on that. Any other questions? So I think we have answered all the questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we have quite a bit of questions coming in, Hisham. So maybe what we could do as a precursor to the secondary webinar, we can probably answer these and make them available to you guys. But these are really excellent questions. So thank you very much for bringing them to us.
So we are a bit over, Noel. We're 5 minutes over. I like to keep things short. That's why we moved from 1 hour to 30 minutes, which we try to do more often. I hope that this webinar, except the noise from my neighbors, has helped you guys. Obviously, The book is available for free. Just shoot us an email and we'll send you the PDF book. And also, you have our contact, Noel Nathan, is the process architect. I'm the solution architect here at HDC. And as Noel mentioned, we are based in Montreal, Canada, and we have an office in New York as well. And we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And if you are by any chance on November 13 at the Null Forum in New York, please come and join us, and we'll have a coffee and talk more about CMDB.
Great. Thank you, Hisham, and thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend today's webinar. And as Hisham mentioned, if you need to reach out to us, or if you're in the process of rolling out a CMDB project and are requiring some guidance or some strategic advisory, we're happy to make ourselves available. You can reach us at info@wearehcc.com, or you can contact Hisham through the email address that's shown on the screen. And please do connect with us at Now Forum. We also have a LinkedIn page and would be happy to hear back your feedback. And thanks again. And hopefully we can join you guys. You can join us on part 2 of this series.
Thank you, guys. And have a nice day and happy Thanksgiving to all.
Thanks, Hisham.
Noel, how do you stop it? Hi, Noel. What?